I don't know how often you may have thought about this, but you didn't get a say in where you were born. Of course, you can choose to move, right, when you get older, but you are stamped by the place you grew up, by the place where you were born, and that impacts the rest of your life, right, in ways we don't always even recognize, and you didn't have any choice about that. Not only did you not get a say in where you were born, you didn't get a say in when you were born. There's absolutely nothing you can do to change that, right? You can move if you don't like where you were born, but you can't do anything about when you were born. You can move to another town, another state, another country even, but you can't change the year you were born. You can't move to another decade or another century. You can't join another generation, right? You're stuck with when you were born, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Acts 17 says that God made those decisions for us, and he did so with a purpose. In Acts 17 verse 26, Paul says about God, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods, that's the when, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries, that's the where, of their dwelling place. So God decided when you would be born, he decided where you would be born, and here's the reason why he did that. Paul says he did that we should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. So God had a good purpose in when you were born and where you were born. He chose those circumstances, that situation for you, in the hopes that in those circumstances and in that time, you would seek God and ultimately be found by him. But what about after you've been found by God? What about after that? Like what else might there be in God's purpose for when and where you live, right? If God has determined both the when and the where of our lives, what does that tell us about God's purpose for us? It's clear. We are here on purpose. We are in this time on purpose, and we are in this place on purpose. So we know, at a minimum, right, that our job is to live faithfully and engage faithfully with people in our own time and in our own place. The question is, how do we do that? How do we go about, you can't turn back the clock and say, well, I wish I could have been a Christian 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago. We don't get a choice about that. We have to be faithful Christians right now, in this culture, in this place, in this time. So what does the Bible have to tell us about how we can do that and how we should do that? Well, one way the Bible speaks to that for us is through the example it gives us in the life of the Apostle Paul. So we're going to be looking at Acts 17 this morning. We're going to start in verse 16. I'll read down to verse 21. And we're going to start looking at how Paul engaged with the city of Athens. Now, in one sense, Athens is 1,000,000 miles away from East Texas in 2025. Right? Athens in the first century is a very different place than the place we are in and the time that we are in. And yet, I think as we look at how the book of Acts describes the city of Athens, and as we look at the way that Paul engages the city of Athens, I think you will find that we have more in common. Our culture has more in common with the Athens of Paul's day than you might expect. And if that's the case, then there might be even more we can learn from Paul about how he engaged with the people of Athens. We can learn from them about how to engage people in our own time, in our own place, especially if there are some strong similarities between the Athens of Paul's day and the America of our own day. So let's look together at Acts chapter 17. Again, I'm going to start at verse 16, and I'm going to read down to verse 21. It says, "Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, 'What does this babbler wish to say?' Others said, 'He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities,' because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, 'May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean.' Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new." All right, so what does Luke tell us about Athens that might help us connect Paul's ministry there with the way that we minister in our own place and time? Well, first of all, let's start with the fact that Athens is an amazingly important city. It's a fascinating city, not only in its own time, but even still today. Of course, it was, one of the great cities of one of the great empires of the world, the Greek Empire. Plato and Socrates were born in Athens. Aristotle's school was in Athens, where he taught philosophy. The Parthenon is in Athens, which was dedicated to the goddess Athena, which is probably where the name Athens comes from. Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And so it was a very important, very significant city for the culture of Paul's day. And in many ways, it's still influencing the culture of our world today, right? We're still familiar with some of the thinkers from Athens and some of the great monuments and buildings in Athens and all those things. But Athens was a city, Luke tells us, that was full of idols. Right? They worshipped a number of gods, not just the goddess Athena, right? But a number of gods. Paul saw idols all over the place in Athens. And Athens was full not only of idols, it was full of philosophers. Now, for some of us, as soon as you mention the word philosophy, like we're tempted to check out and be like, oh, that's not for me, right? But what philosophers are doing is they're trying to help all of us think about and answer the most important questions about life, right? Why we're here, what does it mean, what should we be doing? And so that's what Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, what they were trying to do. And even if you've never read a lick of philosophy in your life, you've been influenced by the ways that those men sought to answer those questions. They were influencing people in their own day, and they're still influencing people in our world today. In particular, Luke mentions that there were Epicurean philosophers and Stoic philosophers. Now, both of these philosophies are still present and even popular in our own culture today, in slightly different forms, but they are still very popular. It was just a few years ago, I was sitting in somebody's office and noticed on their desk a book that was something like, 31 meditations for modern Stoics or something. And this was not a philosopher, this was the finance guy at a car dealership, right? He was reading about Stoic philosophy. Why? Well, Stoic philosophers, they tried to help people live life without being enslaved to their emotions, right? So how can I live a life that is reasonable self-controlled, right? Steadfast, not whipped here and there by all of the whatever the latest thing is that's going on. And that has a certain appeal to people, right? Because it helps you to be stable, right? And under control. The Epicureans, their philosophy, see if this sounds familiar, their philosophy was, hey, you know what's good? Pleasure. Pursuing pleasure, that's good. Now, they weren't reckless pursuers of pleasure. They weren't hedonists, right? But they did think the way to pursue the good life, right, is to pursue good pleasures, right? Good experiences. That's what they were after. And these two different philosophies, you can see them both in our culture. And they're almost, you can see how you can see them as like reactions to each other. On the one hand, people are they're pursuing all the good things of life, but then when you don't have them, like, what does that do to you? And you're pulled all around. And somebody says, okay, how about we just don't care about all those pleasures? How about we just distance ourselves from all of that, so no matter what happens, we're cool, we're okay. Again, both of those are popular, not necessarily by name, but they are ways that people pursue the good life in our own culture now. And Paul was engaging with people from both of those different schools of philosophy. And then see if this sounds familiar. Verse 21 says, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. They're all about novelty, all about the new. I mean, if you just added the word watching something new, right? I mean, that's us, right? It's like 100 things to stream and you can't find one that's new and engaging that you don't want. Everybody's chasing something new. You want to hear something new. You want to see something new. You want to experience something new. And that's how the Athenians were. You might think, oh, those guys way back there, all that they were interested in all the time was tradition. Now they were looking for new stuff too. New philosophies, new ways of understanding the world, new ways of approaching life. They wanted to hear what was new. So again, on the surface, Athens in the first century might feel like the furthest thing in the world from your life right now. But when you dig down a little bit, you realize they were asking some of the same questions we are, seeking to answer them in some of the same ways we are. They were chasing some of the same things we do. And you might say, well, but all the idols, I don't see how that connects. Well, we don't necessarily carve statues to them, although sometimes we do. But we have our own idols. We have our own gods that our culture is devoted to, and they're the same ones, just under different names, right? They used to name theirs. Ours is just power, money. We don't have to give them special names. It's just whatever it is. That's what people are devoting themselves to. Fame, whatever it might be. So our culture and this culture that Paul was addressing, they're similar in a lot of ways. So how did Paul engage this culture, and how can we learn from him how to engage our own culture as Christians? Well, notice that Paul's first response, his sort of gut level response to what he sees in Athens, is in verse 16. It says, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was full of idols. And remember, Paul is a Christian, right? He's a follower of Jesus, but he's a Jew, right? He was raised on the Old Testament scriptures, and he was zealous for God. And the Old Testament is very clear about one thing in particular. There is one God you're supposed to worship, and no idols, right? You don't worship that God with idols, and you don't worship any other gods. There's only one God, and you worship him. And idolatry is not only sinful, it is foolish, it is wicked. That was in Paul's bones, right? And so when he walks into Athens and sees all these idols, he gets, you can imagine him getting a little riled up. Right? That it provokes him. He's not indifferent to that. In this way, it's different than us. Like if you were to go on a trip to Greece and you were to go to Athens, you'd probably be like, wow, look at that idol. That is really cool. And you're not going to worship it, but you're just like admiring the beauty, the skill, the craftsmanship of it. Paul sees it and he thinks, this is dishonoring God. This is leading people astray from the truth, because the people there, they didn't create those just for the art of it, right? They created them for worship. And so Paul is bothered by that. He's provoked by that. But he does not go to the synagogue and say, hey guys, when it gets dark tonight, let's bring our ropes and we'll pull down those idols. Bring your hammers, we'll smash them. Let's show these Athenians how foolish their idolatry is by destroying all of their idols. He doesn't do that for multiple reasons, right? One is that wouldn't have the desired effect. Two, Paul is a follower of Jesus, and that's not how Jesus taught his disciples, right, to lead people away from error to the truth. So what does Paul do? He's bothered, he's provoked, he needs an outlet, right, for what's disturbing him in this culture. But here's how he deals with that. Verse 11. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. The devout persons would be the Greeks. They're not Jews, but they fear the God of Israel, so they come to the synagogue. They're not idolaters anymore, right? They worship the one true God. So he goes to the synagogue. That's his normal habit. That's his pattern. He goes to the synagogue, and again, he doesn't try to stir up a mob, right? He doesn't try to get everybody angry. That's what people often do in response to Paul's message, right? Stir up a mob and try to run Paul out of town. He doesn't do that. He goes there and he reasons with them. He preaches to them. He dialogues with them. He explains things to them. What he's doing in the synagogue in particular is trying to persuade them that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the promised Savior. That's what he does in every synagogue where he goes. He shows them, look, if we look at the Old Testament prophecies, if we look at what God said would happen and who he would send, Jesus, who came and lived and died and rose, that's him. That's the Savior. And so he's reasoning with the Jews and the Greeks in the synagogue about Jesus. And then he's not only doing that, though. Look at the second half of verse 17. And in the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there. So he's also going out into the midst of just all the people. Everybody's doing their shopping and trading and working and whatnot. We know that Paul was a tent maker, so he may have set up his own little booth there in the marketplace where he's making tents and just talking to people as they come and go. But he's reasoning with people in the marketplace. So he's talking to the Athenians. And we're not told right here the kinds of things he's talking about, but we know what he says later, right, when he gets invited to the Areopagus to preach. And so he may have been saying things to them like, hey, I noticed you got a lot of idols in this city. Do you think gods would be made of stone? Like, do you think gods need us to build temples to them? Don't you think if there's a God out there that he doesn't need us to serve him, to build him things, that we can't capture him in stone? He was reasoning with them. He was talking with them. He was trying to explain the truth to them and show them where they had gone astray, right? Where they were in error. And in particular, it says in verse 18 that he talked with some of the philosophers. He talked with the Epicureans. He talked with the Stoics. He was not intimidated by them. He knew that he had the answers to life's deepest questions, not because Paul was particularly smart, although he was, you can tell by reading his writing, but because he knew what God had revealed was clearer than men's best efforts at trying to answer these questions on their own. We can try to figure out, like, where do we come from? Why are we here? The Bible tells us, God has told us, he created us. He made us to worship him. He made us for his glory. He made us to be in fellowship with other human beings. All those things. So Paul's talking with them as well. He's reasoning with them. He's conversing with them. So notice what Paul does and doesn't do. right? How can we learn from what Paul does and doesn't do? He doesn't take a hammer to the idols. He doesn't stir up a riot. He doesn't try to burn the place down, right, out of zeal for God's honor. You can imagine the old Paul doing that, right? The Paul who threw Christians in jail because he thought they were wrong to worship Jesus. That Paul might have been tempted to knock over some idols. But the Paul who follows Jesus now, the Paul who is seeking to win people to faith in Christ, he doesn't take a hammer to the idols. Instead, he seeks to persuade. He speaks. He converses. He reasons. He talks. He asks questions. He gives answers. He tells people about Jesus. He points them to the truth. And as he does so, not only does Paul engage Athens, Athens engages Paul. Notice how the Athenians respond to Paul. First of all, they call him a babbler, right? Verse 18, toward the second half of the verse. What does this babbler wish to say? When they say babbler, they don't mean like we mean somebody who's just like talking a lot. What they mean is somebody who seems to be like picking up different ideas from different places and bringing them together. Like a seed gatherer is more literally what it means. So, they've got the school of Stoic philosophy and the school of Epicurean philosophy, and they've got their religion about their gods, and they know all their stories and all. But Paul seems to be kind of taking something from here, and we recognize this, but never put this and this together before, and like, what is he talking about? So they're curious. In particular, they say, verse 18, they say he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities. Well, they got a lot of gods, but they realize the God he's talking about is not one we're familiar with, not one we recognize. He seems to be bringing some foreign divinity, some foreign God. And the reason why they said that, Luke tells us at the end of verse 18, is because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. They didn't know about Jesus. They never heard of a God who would die on a cross and rise again. That was foreign to them, right? The idea of bodily resurrection was not something that would have made sense to them. They would be probably more inclined, most of them, to think about your soul being released from your body, not your body rising from the dead, because they, especially the more philosophical among them, would think more about the spirit, the soul, than the body. So they think he's a preacher of foreign gods because he's preaching about Jesus and the resurrection. But notice what they do in verse 19. They took him and brought him to the Areopagus. And again, you can still go to this place today, right? This sometimes it's translated Mars Hill. It's this great, speaking place there in Athens. And they bring him there saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting." Remember, the Athenians love to hear new stuff. And so they're hearing what Paul is talking about. And they're like, "We've never heard of this. This is different. This is new. We're curious. Bring this guy up here and give him a microphone. Let him speak. Let's hear what he has to say." And so they are curious about what he's saying. They think it's strange what he's saying. Verse 20, "You bring some strange things to our ears." That didn't offend Paul. He was not surprised that what he was saying they would find strange. But they wanted to know it. At the end of verse 20, "We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Again, Jesus, the resurrection, the gospel, the one true God, these things were new to the Athenians. They knew a lot, but they didn't know much about this. But because they were curious and they wanted to learn and they wanted to hear new things, they gave Paul an opportunity to speak to them publicly about God and Jesus and the resurrection. That's something that would not have happened if he had tried to tear down their idols, if he had stood on the street corner and just yelled at them about how wrong it was to worship idols. But if instead, because instead he reasoned with them, he talked with them, he conversed with them, they got curious. They were interested. They were willing to listen. They wanted to hear. One of the things that's similar between Athens and our own culture today that may be surprising, though I think it's getting less surprising, is there are a lot of people for whom the message of the Christian faith is new. It's strange. Some of you lived in a time where it seemed like everybody knew the gospel. Everybody knew about Jesus. Everybody knew the basics of the Bible. That's simply not true anymore. There are many people who have never really heard what Christianity is all about. They've heard and seen some things on TV. It's not really giving them a good idea of what Christianity really is. And if you tell them what Christianity is really about is we believe there is this guy named Jesus who was God, who became man, and he died on the cross to make us right with God, and he rose again on the third day, and he's going to come back one day, and everybody who believes in him is going to live with him in a new creation, a new world, sins forgiven, no more death, no more pain. But that's what we believe. How do you think they would look at you? That's the strangest thing I've ever heard. That's what you believe? I thought this was some political thing, right? I thought it was about rules, all the stuff you're not supposed to do. If we will be faithful, like Paul, just to engage and to get down to what really matters about Christianity, about Jesus and the resurrection, about forgiveness, about who God is. Some people are going to find that really strange, and it may surprise you. But that's okay. It's okay if they find it strange. In fact, it might even be good if they find it strange, because then they might want to know more. They might be curious. They might ask questions. They might say, would you tell me more about that? Would you tell me more about this dying and rising guy that you think is God? What are you talking about? There's an opportunity, right? If we will engage, if we will talk, if we will converse, if we will reason, if we will point people to the truth. People in our culture love new things. And for many people, Christianity is new. That's surprising to us, especially if you grew up knowing about it your whole life. But I can almost guarantee you have neighbors, you have people you bump into at work, you have people you see at the grocery store, who if you told them this, they would say, I have never heard that in my life. And they might even say, would you tell me more about that? That's the opportunity that Paul received. That's the opportunity that we have. Let's ask God to just help us be faithful with it. Let's pray.